So we've already discussed the economic system of capitalism and how Americans generally accepted this idea that free trade, that focusing on individual profits would create a better world not only for the United States, but for the world in general. So now let's talk about where capitalism meets industrialization. Now, we might not have talked about this yet, but maybe we need to make it more clear. What was the Industrial Revolution? How did industry affect the lives of Americans and indeed much of the world? Okay, so what is the definition of industrialization or the Industrial Revolution? Very basically, it refers to a greatly increased output of machine-made goods that began first in England during the early 1700s, and later industrialization would spread throughout the United States and throughout the world. But the United States in particular would take the industrialization far further than any other nation in the world would be able to. As the title of the lecture has already suggested, industrialization had already played an important role in the United States before the Civil War. Remember, the industrialized North was able to produce more guns, more uniforms, more railroad lines than the agricultural South. Okay, so we can see that the North won the Civil War because it was industrialized. So Mr. Ehrlich has a historical theory about this issue. It's like this. The American Civil War was in fact a competition of different economic and lifestyle approaches that both the North and the South had. Remember, the South was mostly rural, meaning the people lived in the countryside. Therefore, their economy was agricultural, and it was a type of agriculture that relied on large plantations and, of course, slave labor. On the other hand, the northern states, or the North, were mostly urban, meaning people lived in the cities. The economy was industrial, meaning people worked in factories, workshops, or in overseas trade. And most importantly, the labor that worked in these factories was free labor, meaning people obtained wages. There were no slaves in the North by the time of the Civil War. So the North won the Civil War, correct? So this meant that the economic future of the United States would be determined by the northern states or the North. This meant that the United States would be based off of industrialization, based off of free labor, based off of city life. All the important things were going to be coming from the North. Okay, so this was a major turning point in U.S. economic history, was the end of the Civil War. Really, the situation in the South was desperate. Whatever industrial development that had occurred in the South before the Civil War was destroyed during and after the war by the northern states. And from now on, when we talk about the South, we will be talking about how the southern states have reacted to losing this war. And we'll try to understand how they recovered from such a disastrous event. Okay, so that's enough background. Let's try to discuss what the Second Industrial Revolution was, so we can figure out what we're talking about here. So basically, after the Civil War, the United States experiences rapid and unprecedented industrial growth, which basically means that the United States starts to produce factory goods at a very fast pace and does so at a rate that has never been seen in world history. So after the Civil War, the United States transitions from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy. Okay, so here are the statistics that support this argument. By 1880, the Census Bureau, which is a government body that determines statistics for the government, figured out that most Americans were working in non-farming jobs. Okay, so even the government statistics proved that Americans were leaving the countryside and were working in the cities. As you can imagine, this transition from an agricultural economy to an industrial economy had an immense or a very large effect on the lives of Americans.
Remember, maybe 3 or 4 units ago, we talked about Thomas Jefferson's vision of the perfect United States. And this was largely an agricultural utopia, meaning the Americans would live happily if they owned land and had farms and stayed away from the urban life, the life of dirtiness, of crime, of industrialization. Well, the irony is that this does not really actually happen. In fact, the complete opposite happens. If we look at the years 1870 to 1920, almost 11 million people moved from the farm to the cities. Meaning during this relatively short period of time, the United States sees a sudden urbanization of all its cities, meaning people moving from the countryside to the city. And we can think of this as people moving from agricultural jobs to industrial jobs.
So what we're going to discuss in our next upcoming lectures, we're going to look at how life was like for these immigrants coming into the cities, what it was like living during the Industrial Revolution in the large urbanized areas, and studying the politics and the culture of the American people during this very important time in history.